Today we are going through Acts 21, and I need a tissue really quick. Sorry. Just felt a little runny there. Alright, so turn to Acts 21, verse 17. So we are very deep in our study of Acts. I think I've been here for several different phases of Paul's journey. I think the last time I was here, we went through Acts 18, so we're already on Acts 21, so making some headway, which is nice. But, I think the last time I was here, Paul was going up to Ephesus, and he was meeting with the Ephesian church. And now, after that chapter, we have Paul moving throughout, the rest of his third missionary journey. And then we have in Acts 21, or in Acts 20, his farewell to the Ephesian elders and everything like that. And then after that, we go to Jerusalem. Okay? So on the way back, I think maybe last week was this passage, the beginning of Acts 21? Okay, yeah. So last week we discussed sort of the dangers that are going to lie ahead in this chapter, in the end here. There's a lot of prophets who came up in the beginning of chapter 21, or maybe 20 as well, somewhere, in a lot of different places, and they said, hey, there's danger coming towards you when you go back to Jerusalem. Okay, there's several people who begged him in the Spirit of God, that's what it says in the book, to not go to Jerusalem. But Paul had the inclination, the internal impetus, I guess, motivation, or maybe even a call from the Holy Spirit to go back to Jerusalem. Because last time I was here, Paul, if we remember carefully, was under a vow, okay? And he hasn't gone out of that vow. He hasn't gone back to Jerusalem. So generally they try to make it back to Jerusalem for a feast or something like that when they go under this kind of vow. It's a very deeply spiritual vow, very deeply Jewish vow, and it's going to get him in trouble in this chapter as well. So, he was trying to make it back to Jerusalem because he had to cut his hair for him to perform the vow right and to complete the whole thing and the whole process. So he had to do that and present the hair in the temple in Jerusalem. So he had to be back to Jerusalem. So all these people come up and they start telling him, "Go, you can't go, you can't go." And then this dude comes up and he snatches Paul's belt. I don't know how he even got it off, but he ties his own hands and his own feet together. And he's like, "This is what's going to happen to you in Jerusalem, all right? The Jews are going to mob you, and then you're going to get handed over to the Romans." That's just what he said. So now we arrive right here in verse 17. Paul arrives at Jerusalem because he doesn't care what people say is going to happen. Verse 17. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all of the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. They said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, though, telling them that they should not circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do this. Do what we tell you. Here are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, pay their sacrifices, so that they may have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. So, Paul finally finishes his third missionary journey. Each journey he went out a little bit further than the last time. So the first time he goes makes a little arc. Second journey he follows the same path and then a little bit further. Third journey he goes all the way, goes a long way. So he went out a little further than the last time this time. So this last journey probably took him about maybe a little over 4 years to complete. Okay, between 4 and 5 is what I could find. Now, Paul was just in Ephesus for a while before he was compelled to go back to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Passover. So they took a couple of stops along the way, and many of the people started warning him and everything. So even though he was tested by the Spirit, Paul didn't cave in. And we get to this moment where James is suggesting something here that's very important for us to understand. And I don't want us to go over this because this is where all of the sermons, I guess, that I looked up, like every sermon that I could find on this passage was dealing with these couple of verses right here in verse 23 to 26. Because there seems to be a pretty big moral dilemma that's going on here that they, a lot of interpreters, maybe I was missing something. I didn't really see it this way, and I'll explain why. But a lot of people who are interpreting this passage, they see this as a huge moral dilemma. What James is asking Paul to do, they see it as something that is sinful. So, James is suggesting, essentially what he's saying, I guess, is that there's now thousands of Christians, right? So this is in Jerusalem. This is where it started, okay? This is where the tongues of fire in Acts 2 came down, and 3,000 people on one day came. So James is like, hey, there's thousands. In the book it actually says, the translation literally says myriads. There are myriads of people here who are now Christians, and they're Jewish in Jerusalem. So the vast majority of them are still faithful to observe the law of Moses, which, let's be clear, Paul is not against. Okay, people make it seem like he was against, and they're going to continue to make it seem like he was against the law of Moses, but Paul was never trying to abolish that law. He only comes into conflict with the law when it comes to matters of salvation and absolution of sin. So James is suggesting, though, that the Jews are to continue living under the law of Moses. Okay? And to follow the letter, and to follow the letter of the law to a T. While the Gentiles are to follow whatever the church wrote to them. So the Gentiles kind of have it easier than the Jews. So basically what James was saying is that if you're Jewish and you're a Christian, you still have to follow the law and the customs and do all the rituals and everything like that. But then, if you're a Gentile, you only have to abstain from sacrificed meats, blood, and sexual impurity, immorality, and things like that. So, this was sort of what everybody is thinking that James is trying to say. Or he's trying to make this distinction. So he's like, okay, there's these people here. We have the Jews here in Jerusalem. There's myriads of them. They're all practicing the law. They're going to find out that you're here, Paul. What are we going to say to them? What are we going to do? Because they all think that you are trying to abolish Judaism. They all think that you are trying to replace our religion with this Jesus guy and just completely do away with everything that we have leaned on for 3,800 years or however long they were existing at that point. So, to Paul, Jesus died for all people. Making sacrifices is now an inoperative system of redemption. I don't know if Paul would consider making sacrifices still as a ritualistic thing or as a tradition almost. I don't know if he would consider that sinful. However, I do think that there is like this conundrum here. So James is suggesting that Jews are to continue living under the law and that the Gentiles have it easier. Sorry, I lost my place. Okay, so the law to Paul is inoperative as a redemptive system. He was never trying to throw out Judaism for Christianity. Paul sees Jesus as the fulfillment and the continuation of God's presence to Israel and the world, which came out of Judaism. So again, the last time I was here, even, we talked about Paul going under the vow of the Nazarene, where you grow out your hair and your beard, and you will avoid any products of the vine, like grapes or raisinets or wine or something like that. You can also avoid dead bodies, which Paul kind of didn't do, but it's fine. He wasn't really dead. Maybe he was sleeping. This was back in Acts 19, I think, where the guy, or maybe 20, but where the guy was up in the second story. He was trying to listen to Paul because Paul was preaching all night because he was about to leave. And then this dude falls asleep in the windowsill. He falls out of the window, and he's pronounced dead, right? And then Paul comes up, and he throws his body on him, and he's like, no, he's not dead, he's asleep. Ha! And then the guy wakes up, right? So he could have been touching a dead body, but I also think that Paul was making sure to emphasize in that moment, because they could see his beard, they could see his long hair, and they knew that he was under this vow. So they knew he shouldn't be going near dead bodies. So I think in part maybe Paul said, oh, he's asleep, just to kind of show everybody, hey, I'm still being pious. I'm still being, observant to the vow that I took. But he didn't go near any dead bodies, and that was his vow. To show everybody that he was not going against his vow. He was showing everybody that he wasn't against Judaism, right? So gently, the Jerusalem brethren explained to Paul that thousands of Jews had believed and converted to Christ, and they tried to make him get the sacrifice going for other people. So they were like, here's the solution, right? There's 4 people. They are under the exact same vow as you. You perform their sacrifices, and then we're good. Like, everybody's happy, The Jews are happy. The Gentiles are still happy. Everything's going well. So though these multitudes had become Christians, they had not come to the full realization that the introduction of Christianity made the law of Moses inoperative as a redemptive system. It doesn't abolish it. Accordingly, these new Christians still, they circumcise their children, and they observe many of the customs of the Mosaic law. So the problem was, again, that they didn't think that Paul would do this. He was forsaking Moses. They apparently had concluded that Paul opposed any sort of connection with the Hebrew system. And they even said in Acts 16, I think. Actually, Paul continues to go against these things. Like in Acts 16, Paul circumcised Timothy just to show the Jews. He was like, hey, we are Jewish too, So Paul this is not his fault. There's so many people who are coming up against him in these things. So James comes up with this plan, since Paul was already under the vow, yada yada. Okay, I think we got that. Paul makes his decision now. Verse 26. The next day Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, Help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus and the Ephesian in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached to the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took them and some officers and soldiers and ran to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some shouted another, and since the commander could not get at any of the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried out by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." So there's 2 things that are happening here. One, Paul makes his difficult decision. He agrees to this. And whether you think that this is sinful because it includes a sacrifice of an animal or not, I don't think Paul was really in a moral conundrum. At least there's no evidence in the text that even hints that this is a moral conundrum that Paul is dealing with. So Paul seemingly is perfectly fine doing this sacrifice. So I'm not going to focus on that anymore because I think he understands. And I think if we can get to, if I could ask Paul what he was doing in that place, in that moment, why he made that decision, I think in his mind he would have responded with maybe what 1 Corinthians 9:19 says. It says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, and that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew, in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law." So this is him putting this into practice. And this is also what he did back in Acts 18. This is sort of my whole sermon was like, hey, how do we have the broadest witness that we can possibly have? How do we have this witness that reaches people who are completely different from each other? How can I have the same message work for everybody in the room? And that was what Paul said, I'm going to take a vow. I'm going to show all these people in Corinth who are all about this frivolous life or whatever, drinking and whatever, partying, and I'm going to not drink any wine. And I'm going to specifically give up things that nobody else is giving up. And so to the Gentiles, he was a Gentile. He looked different. He was acting in a way that was working for them so that they could see, and they could see the meaning of it. And then for the Jews, he said, I'm taking a vow. Not so that you can see that I'm pious or that I'm abstaining from different things or whatever, but so that you can see that I'm still Jewish and that I still deeply care about this religion. And I still deeply care about Moses and the law of Moses and the things that have come up, and the prophets and the Torah and everything. He cares about them. He was a Pharisee, for crying out loud. Paul continues to prove that he was a Pharisee by never denouncing Judaism. So, to those who were under the law, he became as though one under the law, so that he can bring those who are under the law into the freedom of God's law, or the law of Christ, which he describes later even in 1 Corinthians. So Paul knows that none of these acts are integral to salvation, like sacrificing a lamb now. So why was taking a Nazarite vow sinful? I don't think so. As we discussed last time, Paul took the same vow. Oh gosh, I keep rewriting things in this. During his last missionary journey for the same reason, to show the Jews had no problem observing and practicing Mosaic law. In fact, it was never recorded that Paul had finished his vow yet, so this was the first time since Acts 18 that we see Paul in Jerusalem. Paul was just in Ephesus. We can clearly see what Paul believes when he's writing to the Ephesian church while under Roman house arrest later. He says, "By grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not by your own doing. It is the gift of God, not the result of works, so that no one may boast. Salvation by grace alone, through faith." Salvation is by grace alone, through faith. That's what Paul believes. And I believe if he got to a point where he had to make the sacrifice, because, we just read he never even got to do it, because he planned it for 8 days or 7 days later, and then on the day before it was going to happen, he gets arrested and beaten and taken to jail. So he kind of got saved. And a lot of people are saying, like, a lot of the pastors that I've watched discussing this passage, they say that this was God like pulling Paul out of his sin, or pulling Paul out of the moral conundrum that he was going to have himself in. And that could easily be the case. Maybe Paul did make a bad decision. Maybe Paul did make a decision to go into this thing and he was just being a little too involved with the law and the rituals in Judaism. And maybe God wanted him to realize, like, hey, you don't have to do that. But I do think either way, Paul was trapped. Because James was like, hey, you're either going to get arrested or you're going to get arrested. So it's like, you're going to get arrested or we can try to appease them this way, right? So he was like, whatever you want to try. And Paul has always been for the purpose, again, of advancing the gospel. So Paul probably in his mind thought, okay, even if this was wrong, he was probably thought, okay, this is something that I can do. It's for the gospel, like it's to show them like something about me so that they can listen to my witness and so that they can bring in the Gentiles and not have this weird schism that's going on, that's continuing to happen in the church. So he was doing all of these things maybe because, like, maybe even though it was sinful in the future, or he was going to have to do something. And so I think it could have been that God snatched him out of that before. And that was God's kind of saving him, right? Because he also said that he was going to be arrested and that this was going to start basically his prison ministry. Everything after this is going to be pretty much just Paul in prison. And so, yeah, there's certain places in your life where you compromise. I guess that's what we can learn from this. There are certain places in your life where you compromise. The core things that save us are related to grace and faith in Jesus Christ. But there will be times in our relationships and circumstances where we change our methods so drastically that we may win more for Jesus Christ. But there's one more thing that happens to Paul here. He's not even getting arrested and beaten based on what he was doing. Like, he did the right thing according to every Jew in this area. And the Jews who were coming from Asia to arrest him and stir up all this trouble. Right? So he was doing the right thing. And he still gets mobbed. And I was thinking about that this week because my passage kind of ends here. Like, this is where I'm done. And then there's this whole section that we'll get to next week where Paul responds to the crowd. And there's sort of this redemption of the story. And it kind of beautifully closes, And I felt really tempted, honestly, David, to just move a couple verses down and just keep going. But honestly, I had to sit with it for a second and I had to think. I was like, there's actually a lot of times where people go through moments just like this. And I remember reading this passage and just thinking, like, the first thought was like, wow, like, where is God in this section? Because God's not really, like, mentioned. His presence isn't mentioned. The Holy Spirit's mentioned throughout the whole book of Acts, but it's not mentioned what the Holy Spirit's doing here in this part. So, where is God? What is God doing in a time where you literally have made every single decision and you've done it painstakingly? Like Paul, he's been balancing like all these plates. Like, I have to please the Jews, I have to please the Gentiles, I have to please God. Like, like I have to try to figure this out. And he comes to this decision that seems to work for everybody. That seems to work for himself. That seems to work for the Jerusalem Jews. It seems to work for the Gentiles who came. I think he still gets beaten up, and just the fact that he gets mobbed again and gets arrested. And this is probably the worst beating that he's gotten yet. I mean, he was beaten pretty close to death one other time. But, like, this is a scene that Luke purposefully wants us to recall the scene of Jesus standing before the crowd in Pontius Pilate. It's very similar language that he's using here. Similar descriptions of the characters, similar descriptions of, like, the crowds saying similar things. Take him away. Crucify him. Like, it's the same kind of deal. And that's sort of what he's getting at here. What Luke was trying to get at is, like, he's trying to paint this picture like Paul is experiencing the suffering that Jesus suffered, is experiencing the suffering that he had to go through. And what Jesus suffered was meaningless suffering. So it got me thinking, like, when we go through meaningless suffering that isn't, redemptive, suffering that isn't just like, you can't put a little bow on it. You can't find a silver lining in it. When you're just in the middle of it and it just happens to you, like, how do we react? Where is God in those times? And it's easy for me to be like, God's right there. You just have to reach out and, like, pray or whatever. But honestly, sometimes it just doesn't feel like that. So my example, and the only example that I can find here, is what Paul does. He just keeps moving. In the moment where you don't know where God is, where he didn't know where God was or what was going on, or why everything was happening the way it was, Paul just kept taking one step. And he had this incredible one-track mind in these moments where he was like, okay, like, this is all for Jesus. This is all for Jesus. So I'm going to take one more step. This is all not even about me. He said this in the last chapter before he even went to Jerusalem. He was like, I'm ready to die. I'm ready to give up my whole life for this thing. I don't care about my body. If they hurt it, if they destroy it, if they kill it, I don't care. All I care about is running the race that Jesus set out for me and doing the things that he's asked me to do. Doing the things that have been required of me. So that the people in his life, so that the people of the world, us, could eventually find Christ. So the power of taking one step, when you really only have one more step that you can take. And that's when God comes in. That's when he snatches up. And that's what we're going to see next week.